Cognitive systems and the military. Here's one. This has been expressed many times. It's a very, I'm not diminishing, I'm not ridiculing it, but I'm saying this is a point that's been raised many times in science fiction, for instance, but also in debates about war. The worry is, I'm afraid that employing robots in warfare with potentially fewer human casualties will increase willingness to go to war. So,
I don't think there's any doubt that that's happened, too. I mean, if there had been so many American body bags, you know, I mean, if we had been, if we hadn't been able to go to war in the way we did with so much technology and being able to do so much from the air, I don't think we would ever have gone to war. I say we, I didn't vote for Bush either, but he's still my, you know, he was still my president at the time.
So I just wanted to reiterate a point that Joanna made yesterday in the military and robotics session. I thought was really important, and certainly important in this context. I think we have to expand our definition of what counts as a casualty. Sure, you know, there'll be less human soldiers dying, but we don't know what the unintended consequences of employing autonomy on a large scale is. We don't know how it's going to affect infrastructure, and infrastructure, of course, is connected to the civilian population. So it's very difficult to predict what the damage is really going to be, and those people are casualties too, right? So yeah, I just don't think we know at this point. I certainly don't have an answer to the question, but I do think that we have to be more inclusive when we talk about the other things.
I think we know pretty clearly, though, that that we do not take the casualties of the other side as seriously. I mean, even to the extent that if there's you know, if people are killed on a ferry that's crossing, you know, we count the number of Britons who were killed on that, you know, when it went down, but we don't count the number of other people. And if it's in Africa, even less do we care. And if, you know, I mean, depending on which part of the world it is. So I think we know for sure that, you know, if an American soldier is worth 10, then if you're lucky, an Iraqi who was on your side is worth 1, and an Iraqi who's against you, well, he was worth -10 or something. You know, you're pleased that he's gone, and it completely changes it. And to address your point about the costs, the thing is, it's about politics too. I mean, George Bush doesn't talk about how much it's going to cost to put vets into care, you know, when he's sending our brave boys off into war. All he has to do is minimize the number of body bags coming back, which are going to be a rallying point for the American population to say, no, we don't want this war. So I would say it's obviously true that where you have the technology and can minimize your own losses and maximize other people's, you are going to be more likely to go to war. I think it's undeniable. I would love to see any evidence to the contrary.
It's not true that employing robots in warfare will cause potentially fewer human casualties. Therefore, the conclusion doesn't go through. And if my interpretation of what you're saying is correct, wouldn't then this argument translate into some kind of ethical responsibility on this community to say widely, precisely to counter that kind of danger that we're pointing out, to say widely, no, going to war with all kinds of autonomous, semi-autonomous devices will in fact increase, perhaps, or certainly not diminish the human casualty. Would you think that would be inadequate response to this kind of problem?
I think that it's certainly logically possible. I think the point that I was trying to make is that we just don't know. I mean, we've not had an engagement where autonomy has been used pervasively. I mean, you can make the argument that at some level we've been using lots of drones in Afghanistan and Pakistan and elsewhere, but by and large they're under the control of human operators, right? Do we know what that situation is going to look like when they become less under the control of human operators? No. We have no data. and there's no way to estimate what the casualties are going to be, and there's no way to estimate how the American public or the world at large is going to respond to situations where maybe there are massive numbers of casualties induced by just us not being able to predict how the technology is going to play itself out once we put it to use.
I wanted to display another comment on this topic, the general topic of the military aspects of cognitive systems. Here's an opinion: we need an adaptation of the Geneva Convention for using military robots, and there's a reference here to something I haven't read, so I'm not sure what it is. Maybe it's a book or a paper. Losing the Rights Watch report. Do you know this one?
Yeah, this is the Human Rights Watch report that was released less than a year ago.
Oh, right, okay. So, Blake, go ahead and give
it's a true comment, but I mean, maybe it's a bit provocative. Everything I've heard over the last 2 days has convinced me that the military are much better prepared for cognitive systems than the civilian world or the care sector. They have clear structures of command. They've thought through the issues of human-robot teams, human-robot interactions. So I'm much less worried about military applications than I am about these hideous, unstructured
It's the idiots who are in charge. It's not the military that worries me. It's the
come back
presidents
at it
that
on
worry
Sunny
me.
because you mentioned this. The military do as they're told by governments, or at least most militaries do, whether or not the idiots rule is not an issue about that's under discussion here. I think the structure of the military, the nature of the research they're doing, and their understanding of human-robot interaction and human-robot teams and shared responsibility seems to me, from what I've heard over the last 2 days, to be ahead of the civilian world, noticeably ahead. They have really thought through some of these issues and made some effort to clear them up. I'm not saying they're all solved, but I see the military as having a lead in this area. Actually, that's all I wanted to say.
It's a softball to you, Prof. So
if
you don't mind, I'd rather...
Thank you so much.
I really wanted to comment on that. But instead, I'd like to, first, while the mic is going back to the woman in the back, could we hear from Madeline?
Yeah. Well, I have to say, Blay, I've got to take issue with you on one thing, but I agree with you. And I heard Paul's presentation and a few of the things I've picked up elsewhere, that as with everything, actually, almost all innovation is coming through the military. Janet gave birth to the internet. I suppose, thank God, at least some of the dreadful things that the military might intend to do with these things, at least some good will come out of the development that's going on in the military, because hopefully we will be applying these technologies more thoroughly in care within the next 20 years. I have to take issue with you when you sort of referred to the sort of uncontrolled or chaotic application of these technologies. Certainly within the care world, they will not be chaotic, precisely because we're so heavily regulated and because risk is so heavily placed on management. But one thing I did want to say, I can ask a question to a fellow panelist, to Paul and perhaps Andrea, but is it clearer in the military world where liability lies? Supposing you've got a drone or an autonomous drone that's supposed to be going off to kill a terrorist in Afghanistan, and instead of going in that direction, it turns around and comes right back again and lands on the Pentagon, which is perfectly possible, I imagine. Who would be liable for that? If there was still a president around to enforce the liability, of course. But is it the producer of that technology? Are you more able in the military to put blame back onto the producer than we will be in the care world? Where will the liability lie for that malfunction?
Well, right now, I think we're in the same place that you guys are at. I mean, there are no rules when you're talking about fully autonomous systems. Just getting back to a point that Sunny made and Joanna reinforced. These systems at some point are going to become so complex that there's going to be no legal grounds to blame a programmer. No legal grounds whatsoever to blame a programmer. It would be like blaming a parent of a 36-year-old person who committed a crime. And you can't possibly do it. Too much has been learned, too much has been developed. So it's unclear, right? And I don't have the answers. My answer is to equip the machines with the kind of common sense moral constructs that we use in our blaming practices and our moral practices, so that they can at least anticipate what sorts of blame might happen if they engage in certain sorts of activities, so that they might avoid them. I think we're going to be in a position where machines are going to be sophisticated enough to be considered at least quasi-moral agents. And if they're quasi-moral agents, they have to have concepts that support that notion of moral agency. Just happens to be a really hard problem. So I guess what I want to reiterate is that if you look at the documents, we're very, very cautious about what's going to be deployed. And anyone who knows anything about military acquisition or going from basic research into a product that's a weapon that's used in the field or even a non-weapon, takes years. It takes years and years of jumping through hoops, years and years of regulation. A lot of these things just get killed for purely political reasons, right? And I wouldn't be worried about rogue scientists putting killer robots into the field anytime soon. I'm working on things 30, 40 years out.
Yeah. Well, can I just say, if we attribute moral responsibility to an autonomous robot, we're talking futurism here, but
absolutely.
I personally don't think the public will be very impressed, because that robot isn't going to be terribly bothered about the fact you said, well, you were morally responsible for bombing the Pentagon instead of the Taliban. The public's going to say, well, you know, we want blood, and that robot hasn't got any, mate. We want somebody's actual living head on the table. You know.
We can build them with blood.
Why? We incarcerate human beings for life.
Incarcerating a robot's not exactly much of an impressive punishment, is
well,
it?
I don't know. I mean, the way I understand blame and sort of more complicated thing, I mean, to really sort of get at blame, you need something that can consider future plans and projects it has. You have to right. So choice and so on and so forth.
Oh, I have a rhetorical question. My name is Maya Dimitrova, Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. I have a rhetorical question. But before that, I was extremely impressed by the military talk and about the moral machines in the military sphere. And that it's not about shooting, and that it's about disaster relief, first response, search and rescue, surveillance, reconnaissance, and medical robotics. So it's all cognitive science community would be happy to work on. And it's not, my rhetorical question is, what if we design military robots that go and play chess, and the winner is the winner?
Make a really short comment, because I was asked this thing about the... So I think the two different fields of private liability and criminal liability have to be kept really separate. The problem of ascribing criminal liability to a robot is, as you said, basically pointless, because criminal liability is just a sanction that derives from the state that punishes you, and therefore you have to perceive the value of your own existence and the fear of being punished, being imprisoned, and so on and so forth. A robot that normally doesn't value its own existence, there's no way of scaring him through a criminal punishment, and it makes no sense to talk about the criminal liability of robots to me. As per liability rules, it's even, again, I want to stress the fact that the persons among which you can choose to hold liable in terms of compensating damages are very limited, and even if the machine is very sophisticated, you can always, I think with the advancement of science that will allow us to have this kind of robots that are show behavior and so on and so forth, there will also be technological advancements that allow them to be safer and to distinguish possible dangerous situations and behave accordingly. So I don't think that this is, I think it's two things that run together. And anyway, a ground for holding someone liable is also because, and I said it before briefly, but I want to stress it, it might be in the best position possible, either to avoid the harm or to compensate it later on. And then he can jump in with insurances and other kinds of compensation schemes. Like if I'm a big producer and I produce 1 billion models of that out and I sell it into the market for profit, I'm probably in the best position possible to raise a bit the price of the product I sell, and with this difference of money, purchase insurance for all the cases that go wrong. So this is something that is not so difficult to conceive. For non-lawyers, you have to stress the idea that blame and compensations do not always go together, and like the idea of blame is actually secondary. The first thing is to compensate the victim, and that way force the internalization of a cost, and on the other hand, like provide the correct incentives to get the right outcome, which is a certain degree of risk and a certain degree of utility of a product being diffused in the market.
Okay, thank you. So,
well, my name's Yasmin, and I'm really puzzled by this distinction that's not really being drawn between liability and blame. So I'm really glad you've just pointed to that. I'm a philosopher, not a legal expert. So I just want to come back to a couple of things that have been said about, for example, the actions of an animal or the actions of a now fully grown child. I do think that if a 36-year-old kills somebody, that the parents may not be liable. But I do think also that we may not say that they are without blame. It will depend on the case, and I think that's really important to keep in mind. I think, for example, if a 36-year-old abuses somebody and they were historically abused, then we might be inclined to blame the person that abuses them or abused them for the abuse that then happens. I'm not saying that that's necessarily what happens. I'm just pointing to the fact that it's not cut and dry. In fact, when it comes to a dog, it's much simpler. If a person, either by neglect or by training, so it could be training or just not training the dog, if that dog then kills somebody or bites somebody who is generally violent, then we do actually hold the person accountable. I'll just finish. Yeah. So my point is that actually, I think the robot's going to be much more akin to a dog than a fully grown adult, which is even then is not cut and dry. Because I think that where, and I'm sympathetic therefore with Vincent's view, where someone has been involved with the programming, then they have a responsibility to think about the outcome of the programming that they include. And so I don't really understand why that wouldn't be part of the thinking with regard to the machine.
So when you sell something, normally you say this can do this task in this set of circumstances, and anything else that happens is your own problem, right? You sell a product into it, and if you're talking about, hold on, but if you're talking about a dog, right? You would say, if you treat this dog well and feed it in this way and treat it and train it in this way, then it will not bite anyone. If you then go and smack that dog every day with a belt, then no longer would the trainer be liable, but presumably the user would be liable if that dog went out and bit a child. So what I would say is that I would expect that manufacturers, as they always do, because they're not going to accept unlimited liability for whatever you may choose, whatever clever thing you may choose to do with their products, that manufacturers will say, within this incredibly constrained set of circumstances, we will accept a certain amount of liability as is regulated for, and beyond that, you're on your own, just like with a hammer, right? If you hit someone on the head with it, it's going to kill them, which is not what we sold it to you for. So it's not our problem anymore that it's a destructive thing.
Can I reply?
Yeah.
I'll keep it. I mean, I think that assumes causal necessity. I mean, it's true to say that if you give someone a hammer and they hit someone with it, you can predict that it's going to harm someone. I think it's more difficult to predict with a dog. And in fact, actually, in terms of liability, it really depends on what a manufacturer is able to predict and what they should predict. For example, the use of nanoparticles in products. At the moment, it's a bit of a minefield as to who's going to be responsible if nanoparticles do cause environmental damage later in the future.
Nanoparticles already cause environmental damage.
Yeah, well, who's agreeing to that is much more complicated. I think there hasn't been a system set up of liability.
In the tube, we're smoking the equivalent of, because I take the tube every day, I'm smoking the equivalent of 4 cigarettes a day just by being in the tube.
Okay, but can I finish? Because my point is about predictability, right? If this machine, if its behavior is unpredictable because it has the capacity to learn, I don't think that means that the person who is training it, programming it in the first instances, has therefore the right to say, well, I have absolutely no responsibility for what happens later because it's unpredictable, in the same way that a scientist who's producing nanoparticles doesn't have that.
I think someone else should come in.
Yeah. I mean, this is why normative systems exist. This is why the law exists. It's because people are unpredictable. And the law provides incentives to behave predictably.
So the incentives for a robot, therefore, would be what?
This is what I'm saying. I mean, I don't
Or
think
software. But the point is, as Blay pointed out earlier, we already have a system where we have software that we can't sue anybody about, even if it does misbehave within these incredibly constrained set of circumstances that we know that it's going to operate under. So I would say that the current legal framework, I'm not saying what the legal position should be. I'm just saying that if we have genuinely autonomous cognitive systems, the law as it is currently written does not adequately cover them, right? There are complicated questions to be answered, and it can't just be done within the bounds of, you programmed it 10 years ago and you said it was going to do this, and now it's spent 10 years working in a salt mine, and this is how it behaves, and now you're responsible.
Okay, maybe this is really off topic, but I thought. Okay, so there's something I really would like to put on the agenda, because I think it's really important for this community, but I think it's not really talked about. So this is the EUCOG meeting. I remind you, European Network for Advancement of Artificial Cognitive Systems, Interaction and Robotics. Quite often it seems all we really talk about is robotics and a little bit of AI, and that's come up a lot. But I would remind people, this may be a little bit controversial, but we interact with intelligent systems of various sorts all the time. They play an incredible, if you think about a less fashionable topic perhaps, but intelligence augmentation, many of the systems that we use in our mobile gadgetry, when we perhaps interact with Amazon, and these kind of systems are diffusing more and more into our everyday lives. In fact, they're the success of many AI programs, and now, very much as Sunny I think was saying, they've become practically invisible to the point we just take them for granted. Well, maybe we shouldn't take them for granted. Just think about an intelligent filtering system which filters the news that you, the consumer, consume, and blanks out a huge part of the stuff which might be really important that you really should know about. Is there any kind of ethical implication of this for the companies which are putting these things together and effectively, many of the results may be very good, we may love them, but nevertheless they do seem to have ethical implications, and we said nothing about them.
I don't think that the question of learning for artificial cognitive systems or robotic systems actually can be a computer system too. It doesn't matter. Are going to be as straightforward as one person teaching the system something, right? I may buy it, and if purchasing it is a problem legally, then think of giving it to somebody, lending it to somebody, right? There's all different kinds of things that don't have cost involved in the way that you've indicated it. The legal question, I agree fully with you, right? The legal question is not clear. If the system picks up parts on its own, parts from other people, right? Multiple people involved in the teaching, there's going to be no easy causal story to tell, right? Who caused it to learn it? More importantly, think of systems that learn how to learn, right? So it's not even immediately the algorithm that they put in, but it's the algorithm the original people put in that allowed for other learning algorithms to evolve under certain environmental conditions, and then using those, it learned something, right? So it's not a clear-cut story.
Thank you. I was very much wanting to reflect on what both Madeline and Paul were talking about with regard to kind of agency, moral agency, and blame attribution. And although I'm very attracted, by Paul's argument, I think it's a very interesting argument that autonomous warfighting robots should not be deployed until some future time when they are fully, as it were, moral agents. Nevertheless, I'd like to argue, perhaps reinforce something I was arguing in my talk this morning, which is that, that I think we can start to build kind of minimally ethical robots. You could think of them as kind of ethical zombie robots in a much shorter time frame, and they would be worth building because they minimize harm, but nevertheless, in the way that Madeline stressed, there still must be a human responsible. You know, just reflecting on the point about learning, adapting systems, I don't think it makes any difference whatsoever. You can still have an attributed responsible person even for a system that learns, because they accept that responsibility. They sign up. They say, "This is my robot," and hence you can retain that human responsibility.
So, Vincent, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I think that's right, and I think the discussion we had so far sort of is veering off, of course, a little bit into the sci-fi direction. So what if the systems would acquire enormous abilities which we're not certain that will actually ever happen? So I think there is a real problem there. If we think that there is a system at some point where there will be no criminal liability and no civil liability, then it seems to me that we as a society would have to stop that. We cannot have systems running around our society which will do things which are morally relevant, that they will do such things, and nobody is going to be responsible for them in these two ways. So, but of course what's relevant, I think, for the discussion that we're having now is to hold on to the notion, it seems to me that we want to hold on to this, that we will have liability in the conventional sense so far, right? These will be companies and people, and they will be responsible, they will be liable in the conventional sense, and they might improve on their own liability and the ability to actually deploy these systems by doing things like what you just outlined, to say, you know, I'll have a what's that, morally zombie system that will do something very basic, so I make sure that the system itself isn't misbehaving because I'm in the end liable, and I can then deploy it in the care context and so on. But I think, you know, let's keep the ball a bit flatter here. I think that is the basic situation, the way we're looking at it so far, it seems to me.